assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
You're listening to Paranormal UK Radio.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Paranormal UK Radio, the flagship show here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Our regular host, Irene Allen Block, is feeling under the weather tonight, so she's taking the night off. So I'm your co-host, Mark Johnson. I'll be stepping in tonight to take over the festivities. So, Irene, really hope you feel a lot better, and we'll definitely catch you next week when you're doing well. Just make sure to behave and don't go running around the garden naked. That's probably how you got sick in the first place. And so we've got a lot going on here coming up in October on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. We have a new show coming up, starting within the next couple of weeks. We'll be announcing more as it comes up. We have a show called Serial Spirits. This is a new show from Brandon Shea and Annie Weebley. And they're going to be doing I believe it'll probably be a bi-weekly show talking about serial killers and other paranormal topics, and it's going to be really exciting. So we're looking forward to that premiering soon. Also, I just give a mention about my other new show, Shamanic Reality. I've got a new episode that's recording and will be airing on Thursday night. That's tomorrow night on the Paranormal UK Radio Network at 11 p.m. Greenwich Mean and Eastern Time. And I'm going to be talking with Karen Furr, who is a shamanic practitioner, and she also teaches how to do depossession. And it's not exactly what you think. It's going to be a really fascinating topic. I should know I took her class, I trained with her, and it was one of the more unique experiences I've ever had. So that'll be Thursday night at 11 o'clock. So anyway, I think we're going to get right into the show. So tonight, I'm pleased to welcome back to the program Dr. Rita Louise. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Rita is the founder of the Institute of Applied Energetics and is the host of Just Energy Radio. She's a naturopathic physician and a 20-year veteran in the human potential field. Her unique gift as a medical intuitive and clairvoyant illuminates and enlivens her work. She's also the author of several books, including the E.T. Chronicles, Man-Made Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, and her brand new book that has just come out, Stepping Out of Eden. So Rita, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Mark. And hi, everybody in the UK.
In the UK, the US, and around the world. I'll tell you, Rita, we've been getting a lot of people around the world tuning into the show, so we're pretty excited about that. But yes, we like to cater especially to our UK audience. So, Rita, it's been a while since you've been on the program. So, just for giggles, could I trouble you to tell our audience just a little bit more about yourself? And then let's talk about the new book.
Okay. Here's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay.
So growing up, and I'm going to try to make this quick. So growing up, we were required to read a book every 2 weeks in order to get our allowance. So it wasn't about chores. It was about reading a book. And I was never interested in reading books like Nancy Drew or, fiction type books. I found myself drawn to the archaeology and anthropology section at the library, where by the time I was in 8th grade, had basically worked my way through everything they had. And just on a side note, was so excited when I discovered that the La Brea Tar Pit was actually in downtown Los Angeles, right next door to the Museum of Modern Art, which I didn't know, and got to go there. Anyway, but then I got turned on to the whole concept of ESP, which today you would say, the concept of psychic abilities, and started studying that material and read all of these books, waiting for one day to become enlightened, because I knew that if you were enlightened, you would have psychic abilities as a byproduct, which never happened. So then,
isn't that disappointing?
Well, I understand, in hindsight, I understand why that didn't ever happen. But then I discovered the Berkeley Psychic Institute and studied with them and realized that, well, one, I had been having psychic experiences my whole life, some pretty profound psychic experiences, but no one ever connected the dots for me. And so even though, and just to respond to your comment, even though I was doing all of this reading, none of the books ever talked about the experience, and they never brought forward that having a psychic ability is about having an experience. So it didn't have anything to do with all of the reading, although I'm really smart now on the topic. But it didn't, it didn't connect dots for me. I mean, and this was many years, I won't say how many years of reading a bunch of books. Finished that up, was guided to go back to school, went back to school and got a degree as a naturopath, then went back to school again and got my PhD in natural health counseling. But the story doesn't end there, because then I started writing and wrote the books The Power Within, Avoiding the Cosmic 2x4. Then, you kind of follow my life along. Then I kind of got into my ghost hunting phase and ended up writing a book based on personal experiences called Dark Angels, An Insider's Guide to Ghost Spirits and Attached Entities. And then one of the things that I find the most fulfilling is, Ancient Aliens, or that kind of show genre, came out. And it gave me the opportunity to go back to my first love, the concept of looking at archaeology and anthropology and anything that's old. Like once you pass the Greeks, they're not, it's not old enough. I love looking at things that are ancient in nature and understanding the philosophical underlying components of culture. And so it has given me the opportunity to go back to my first love in life. And from that has emerged E.T. Chronicles, what myth and legend has to say about human origin. And then my new book, Stepping Out of Eden, which are, they really work hand in hand together. One talks about creation mythology, which I'm sure we're going to get into. And then the other book, the new book, really talks about the human experience and how humanity developed over time.
And, that's why we're going to have such a good time on this, because I'm right there with you in terms of looking at our ancient history, going back way farther in time, and looking at the alternative views of so-called history, because it's way different than what they taught us in school. That's for sure.
Oh, no kidding. I keep having discussions. That's a nice way of saying it. Discussions about the concept of mythology. And actually, I posted something on Facebook today, because regardless of where you look, whatever book it's in, dictionary, websites, they all say that mythology is, stories to talk about nature, or they're archetypes to explain our place in the universe, or they are, just figments of our ancestors' reality. And the question that I come back to them with is, who made that decision? What individual or group came up with myth equals fantasy? Because if you ask the Greeks, or you ask an indigenous culture in Australia or the Native Americans, they don't think that their mythology is fantasy or talking about nature. They think that they're true and honest, factual, or somewhat at least factual events. So where in our society did this shift come to say myth is bad, myth is, some Danielle Steele novel that our ancestors memorized and passed on for thousands of years? Doesn't make any sense.
Well, it's an excellent argument, because in my opinion, and from what I've read and understood, it really didn't start happening until about the 1700s into the 1800s, when this whole age of reason started coming in. and science started taking more of a forefront and becoming more accepted in society. And then, of course, what came along with science is, well, unless you could prove it in a lab, it's nonsense. And so they looked at all of these ancient tales as, oh, they're fairy tales, it's myths, they're legends. And of course, there's the bias in societies that, if you come from one culture and you hear another culture's stories, you blow it off as a myth because, that can't be true. That's impossible because it doesn't coincide with my own beliefs. So I think a lot of Western society and a lot of, as we move more towards the modern era, they don't want to look at the idea of, like in India, in the Indian epics, the Ramayana, or talking about Vimana flying and aerial battles or any high technology, because that has to be fantasy, right? They couldn't have had that back then. And also the fact that our modern science and archaeologists and anthropologists, they like a nice linear beginning to end in our history. Smooth, no jumps and starts, apes to cavemen to early civilization, invent the wheel, and then go on from there. Not realizing that that's a convenient explanation, but it's not a factual one.
And I agree with everything you've said. They can't explain the stories. They can't explain how these primitive people, could have these things, the marvelous technology. And from a contemporary perspective, one of the arguments that I put back is, where did they come up with these ideas? And so, and I'm not even going to go back far in time, but let's say Egyptians, okay, so 2500 BC. Where did they come up with these ideas of flying ships and these ray guns and all of this stuff when their best technology was a chariot? And we go back further in time and the stories are well in place. This is married. The stories are well in place. One of the things that I often talk about is that in Western society, we're really brainwashed. And no one wants to talk about that and how we in the West look at everything through these lenses of this is how the world should be. And these are the explanations for it. But if you go to other cultures like in India, they believe in flying ships. They believe in multiple gods. They believe these stories are true, or at least have a certain level of factual basis to them. And so you don't have to talk about extraterrestrials to them because they already believe in sky gods.
Yeah, and a lot of even Native American cultures believe in the star ancestors, the sky ancestors, the people coming from the sky. And it's our modern arrogance and conceit that we think we invented everything first. We invented the airplane, then we invented the rocket ships, and we invented space travel. We invented everything. It's like, we're late to the party. There's so much evidence out there that shows that we once had far greater technology than we do now. And there's quite possibly that technology, some of it came from elsewhere.
Well, my contention is, and what I talk about in my books, is that the technology that they talked about didn't belong to humans. We're human. We did not have the technology. We were exposed to the technology, but it wasn't our technology. And so if God is invisible, or the gods are invisible and figments of our imagination, then who had this technology? Because I don't believe it was us.
Well, and then let's take a look at, where humans came from between history and mythology, what they think they know. And I, of course, mean the scientific community, the archaeologists. And I've always found it amazing that they can look at a piece of pottery or find a bone fragment and then suddenly come up with a whole history, an idea of a culture and civilization. And yet when you really take a moment to look at it, all they have is that bone fragment.
Exactly.
And then they try to tell you, well, it's this old. Well, how do you know it's that old? Well, we have radiocarbon dating. Yeah, but if it's fossilized, turned to stone, you can't radiocarbon date it. Well, in the strata, it's here at 6.5 billion years. How do you know that? How do you know exactly? And my favorite conceit is the fact that they think human civilization is 5,000 years old, starting with the Sumerians. Sumerians being, the first civilization. Okay, well, if that's the case, where do the Sumerians learn from? Because it didn't just pop out of the ground. The big cities, the statues, the buildings, the history, everything that they've came up with, and yet they try to tell us that the Sumerians were the first.
I mean, when the Sumerians come on the scene, they had a very well developed and established social structure. There's the architecture part that leaves us with a little contention, and these things, actually. Can we come back to this point of where the Sumerians got this?
Yeah, that's fine.
Because that's like a big part of where we're going.
Sure, not a problem.
This book. Yeah. But I'm going to share this, and I think you'll appreciate it. We're talking about, things that we know and how we think we invented all this stuff. So there was an article, and it passed on my Facebook thing, and then it disappears, so you can't take any notes down. But I read the article, and the scientists were talking about how as humans we can perceive things outside of our body, and there are these mechanisms inside our bodies that take information from the world around us and allow us to access it. And so my comment on the post was, yeah, those mechanisms are called chakras. Well, I got some mean commentary back. It's like, I'm sorry, but there's all of this stuff that the ancients knew about and had exposure to. And if you go down to your metaphysical bookstore, I'm sure you could learn all about it. But that they're coming out, and I appreciate that science is validating what has been talked about for thousands of years. Years ago, I've studied Kabbalah, and chakras and all of that stuff. And it fascinates me as you dig into it, how much you don't know, the more you dig into it. And this information comes from cultures that are thousands of years old, that have bows and arrows, if that. And, maybe they have agriculture. Woohoo! Where did they get it from? It is mind-boggling to us today with our scientific minds looking at this material. Where did they get it from? And that's kind of one of the questions that drives me forward is, well, where did they get it from and what do they know?
And that's why modern science won't acknowledge it. And people will make fun of you, especially in this age of social media where it's like openly attacking everyone is the norm if you don't agree with an opinion. But being able, science won't acknowledge chakras because they can't cut somebody open and find one. Well, I don't see no chakra here, so that's all fantasy and it's made up. And yet they don't understand how the energy flows through the human body and how we're made up and the structure that goes a little bit beyond our physical makeup.
But how did the ancients know all of this? You sit there and you think about it, it's like, well, how did they know? But they do know. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. From my own work, I can validate their existence, just from the experience of it. But yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling on some levels. It's a little bit of a rabbit hole. How's that?
Well, I can also mention in some of the training and things that I've been looking into these last couple of years, I think a lot of the information, and I know a lot we may be talking about it coming from outside influences, whether it be extraterrestrial or whatnot, but I've been studying a lot of the more shamanic types of practices and belief systems, and with that there is the ability, let's say, in primitive cultures and more primitive societies, they have their shamans, their medicine people, healers, whatever. The people, part of the person in the tribe that interacts with the quote unquote spirit world, with the spirits, and gathers information. And it's, to me, it's more of an advanced form of connecting with your higher self, being able to access different levels of consciousness and even possibly even other dimensions astrally. And there's a lot of information that can be gained there. And I'm not saying that that's where they got it, because I do agree with you on some of these outside, possibly extraterrestrial influences, but there's still a possibility that some information, the more primitive people had access to information that we poo-poo today because it just sounds too hairy-fairy for them.
Well, and actually, this is a great segue question, because that really is kind of the focus of this new book, Stepping Out of Eden. And one of the chapters that I spend a lot of time on is the concept of the ritual experience. Why, when we think of Native Americans, when the first Europeans came to America and they experienced Native Americans, and they're like singing around a fire and stamping around and chanting, and they looked at them like they were crazy people doing really weird stuff. But when you start looking around the world, that is the norm for many cultures. And if you take contemporary rituals, things that happen in like church or etc., are actually just a more pristine derivation of the ritual experience. And so the question I asked was, well, what was the point? What is the point of doing these rituals and stuff? And it seems like, that was the point, was in order to create this deeper level of consciousness. When you do a ritual, it is, in indigenous cultures, it's a community event, so it's not the shaman going in his living room and doing this ritual per se. It's usually this whole group of people participating together, creating this group dynamic, raising the energetic vibration of the individuals in the group that help accelerate the shaman to move forward, to move into, and this is what the Sands people of Africa call it, and I like it, into the first world, into the world of spirit. And you're right, there are many people that claim that when you enter into that world of spirit, you can get guidance, you can get information, you can get downloads from these spirits, which brings up, totally separate question, were these extraterrestrials physical or were they spirit? And I think the reality is that we have to look at both of them as being two separate groups, because people definitely do communicate with something on spiritual levels, and that practice we were taught that practice, and it has been used for, thousands and thousands of years. And what I find interesting is that, when the group participates in the practice, the group gets a healing as well. I mean, it's, like a meditative experience. And so if you have this community that is participating in regular rituals for whatever reason they're doing them, you have this giant meditative event that's happening. And can you imagine, Mark, if everybody in your town was participating? You go to the Greek festival, but the Greek festival is everybody's, participating and doing ritual, except in Greek. What a difference the world would be, because we would be in this more higher charged energetic state more often.
I agree. And it's that higher charged energetic state is actually states of consciousness that we've forgotten. We have programmed out of us at a young age in this society, where, this so-called age of reason and age of modern science tells you to forget about the things that you're feeling and only look at facts, what you could put under a microscope, not taking into account different levels of consciousness. Although, there's a lot of hypnotists, hypnotherapists who work with the consciousness and go in really deep and find some of the layers, but even that seems to be too fringe for a lot of modern science. And
can I interject?
Be my
something?
guest.
Sure. So one of the things that they have found out, and this was a study that they did with a group of Tibetan Buddhist monks whose main focus is doing meditation, is that okay, so you're talking about consciousness, and I'm going to kind of shift that a little bit to brainwave activity. Mm-hmm. We can measure that. They can measure that. So there are different 5 brain waves: delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. And so there's like when you're sleeping, delta. When you're in a very, very deep meditation is theta. Alpha is kind of a resting state, kind of relaxing state. Like the word Om generates alpha waves. Now we today exist primarily in our beta waves. And I'm just going to read this little blurb because it's a little sciencey for me. Mm-hmm. So beta waves are the waves associated with daily activity in our waking consciousness. We are alert and engaged in focused mental activity, although anxiety or excitement can appear when we are in this brain state. Some suggest theta or beta waves support automatic endeavors where we move through life without any creativity or inventiveness. And so that's our normal waking consciousness, and electronics and EMFs push us even further into more intense beta waves. And so we're just like going around like automatons. And then,
yes.
And then there are gamma waves, which are they're very creative, high intense waves. And so when you have one of those aha moments, as Oprah says, a light bulb moment, it's because you were perhaps in a more meditative place. You were thinking about something, kind of meditating on it. And then it's kind of like, oh yeah, I know the answer. It's because you moved from that relaxed state into a gamma state and then back again. And so these Tibetan monks actually are able to engage that gamma state for much longer periods of time. And one of the things they have found is that the shamanic practitioners that are able to communicate with spirit exist or are able to go into that gamma state. And then one of the other things that they found, which I kind of laughed at, is that when individuals take hallucinogenics like ayahuasca or DMT, it allows them to enter and stay in that gamma state for a longer period of time. And so there's all of this effort to be able to get to that gamma state, to get to that higher level of consciousness and stay in it longer so that you can have an extended visit with spirit. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and being able to access that. And what is that extended, what is that connection with quote-unquote spirit? I sometimes think that even that term is very misunderstood. If you start looking at the different levels of consciousness and reality, you mentioned earlier brainwaves, and everything is energy. Everything, even solid matter, vibrates. Everything has its own vibration, and you can raise those vibrations, lower it, and in dealing with not only in your own consciousness, and even dealing what I think is different realities, all vibrating at different levels, different vibrations, all occupying the same space, but yet because they vibrate differently, you have to tune into them like a radio. You're at this frequency, you get this. And you tune it a little bit higher, then you get this.
Oh, exactly. And I think even a very simplistic explanation or example is, all right, correct me if I'm wrong. Well, I'm just kind of like pulling this out my butt, even though I know like the basis of it is real, but there's the note, the musical note, like middle C. And if you go like 8 octaves in frequency above middle C, okay, and I'm just kind of guessing here, you get the color green. And so from a frequency point of view, they're like the same frequency except, like octaves up. Did that make sense?
Yes, it does. I mean, because even musical notes are, what are they? They're vibrations at certain frequencies.
They're vibrations. But I don't think people realize that if you take a vibration that we have that's auditory, if you amplified that vibration by X factor, that it's going to turn into a color, that same vibration.
See, I wasn't even aware of that. So
yeah, I learned that studying some Rife material. So that was pretty cool. And so, and our thoughts and feelings, they each have a vibration. There's our universe, which has a vibration, and we can see so much vibration within this universe. But then there's stuff that's in it that we can't see, like X-rays. We can't see it. And then there is, I like to say that in a different time-space continuum where, we experience ghosts. I mean, because they're there. But we can't see them because they're vibrating at a different frequency that's outside of our visual perception. And people that work as more psychic type people, have trained themselves to be able to see into that visual reality range.
Exactly. It's like even with modern science, they talk about dark matter and how dark matter takes up, the largest percentage of what's out there in space. It's not empty space. It's filled with a lot of this dark matter that they don't know what it is, yet they're able to show that it's there. They're just not sure what it is. Sometimes I think that maybe that dark matter is some of this stuff that's vibrating at different frequencies and is actually things bleeding in from different realities or different levels of reality.
Well, that's an interesting theory. See, I haven't heard that one myself, but I kind of like it. I mean, because there is a lot. I think they estimate that the visual universe is only 20% of what we see. And so in between every star or planet, all that vastness of space is occupied by dark matter.
Yeah. Go
you and I both do the ghosty thing, and so you'll appreciate this, but I'll have people that'll be going, well, but I experienced this ghost. And I'm like, there's spirits everywhere. Don't you get it?
Yeah.
They're everywhere.
My question to them is, well, how do you know it's a ghost? Well, I saw this shadow in my room that night. Okay, so how do you know it's a ghost? I've upset clients with that one before because trying to get people to think outside the box, get away from our brainwashing and what they think the paranormal activity really is and what they're dealing with, and start looking at new concepts and ideas. And Irene and I have talked about this a lot in the past on our show. Just because you see what looks like an apparition of a woman in Victorian clothing, walking down the hallway, doesn't mean you saw a quote unquote ghost. And what do people think of a ghost? It's a spirit of a person who's died and doesn't know that they've died, or it has unfinished business, so it hasn't moved on to the other side yet. And it's wandering around doing its own thing. And that is, in my opinion, just such a narrow point of view. As we start to learn more about reality, that we learn more about time and the concept of time, and now they're starting to show that all time, past, present, future, is happening at once. It's all happening together. It's only our understanding of time that makes us think it's linear. That's the only way our brains will interpret it. And if we are looking at time as all time happening at once, then I think a lot of times that when people think that they've seen a ghost or an apparition, they're not seeing a spirit of somebody who's died. They may actually be seeing a living, breathing human being. And for whatever reason, the conditions are right at that moment that you're seeing into a different time.
So I have a little factoid for you.
Okay.
So do you know or a factoid question. So do you know what the oldest documented mention of a ghost is? Where we find the oldest mention, like written mention of a ghost?
No, you might have me on that one.
So in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which, is Sumerian, Enkidu, who is Gilgamesh's friend, realizes he's going to die. And he said, but I don't want to become a ghost. And so, by 2700 BC, which is where they feel that story originated minimally, at least I say minimally, that the understanding and concept of ghosts was well understood by people. And the reality is that most indigenous cultures have a huge fear of, people, whatever spirits from the other world coming and bothering them and affecting them. That's a huge issue for them.
Well, see, one of the things that when you start to think about it, and this is something, and I think about a lot of weird things. My wife looks at me strangely sometimes when things start coming out of my mouth.
That's probably why we get along.
is that where would you think that the concept of ghosts and spirits would come from to begin with if they didn't exist? And the reason I'm saying that is let's say you're a primitive person. What are you dealing with? You're dealing with providing for your family every day, hunting, fishing, gathering, possibly maybe you've learned agriculture, and you're dealing with the weather, the elements, the animals, all these things. So with all this real world stuff, all of a sudden, who in the hell comes up with this idea of dealing with ghosts and spirits and afterlife and whatnot when people have seen no evidence for it in the past, supposedly? So how did these stories get started unless people are having experiences?
Who is it? Pliny the Younger, one of them old, Greek guys, which I'm having a little difficulty remembering which one. He actually reports having a ghost that haunted his house, and there are a lot of Greek writers that talk about ghosts, but I'm going to shift your concept a little bit. So if we follow the mainstream narrative that we evolved from simpler forms into more advanced forms, from apes into humanity, it's like, I know my dog has seen ghosts, because she sat there on the back of a chair barking at something and barking and barking and barking. And finally, I looked at what she was barking at, and there was a ghost standing in my living room. So I know that she would bark at ghosts. So what would change? So if we were these ape creatures and we evolved, what changed in us that we went from this was just normal occurrences that happened because we already knew ghosts exist because, we were on the back of the chair barking at it, to becoming scared of them?
Well, I think it's because if you take a look at, and I can mostly point at Western society and Western religions, from Christianity onward, where when the church is formed, it's like, well, you believe this set of things, and anything else that's outside of it, well, it has to be evil, and you have to be afraid of it. So
no, it goes back further than that.
Oh, I'm sure it does.
One of the things that I spent a whole chapter on, you'll appreciate this, is the whole thing about ghosts, because it was huge. It was huge, because they thought that ghosts could make them sick, that ghosts could create ill will and ill fortune in their lives. I mean, they blamed a lot of stuff on ghosts and spirits. All right, you ready for another factoid?
Sure. Fire away. So
did you realize, this I found very fascinating, that burial rites were created so I'm going to back up. So the things you mentioned earlier, like they're stuck here on the earth, they have unfinished business, yada, yada, yada. You hear that. around the globe in multiple cultures of why there might be ghosts. But the strongest reason that is explained, again, my research, I look at cultures around the globe, was they didn't have a proper burial rite. So, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it talks about, well, the person's sick, you should sit by the side of their bed and, kind of putting it in a Western vernacular, telling them, and don't forget, go to the light. And then when they die, you're supposed to say and be with them and be with their spirit and help them to go into the light, that they pass over successfully. Because if they don't cross over successfully, then they're going to come and torment you, which I found very interesting. And one of the comments I make in the book is, so the reality is that burial rites, the reason why we have funerals and we say words over people and songs are played and this ritual is done to send the person off into the afterlife doesn't really have to do with our feelings about the person leaving, but more about our desire for them to pass over good and have a good transition so they won't come back and haunt us. I found that concept, that was where it was or is in indigenous cultures, is we want them to pass over good. We're going to leave them some grave goods. So if they get hungry, bam, they got some bread to eat.
Well, I mean, I know they're in like some native cultures, in the Navajo, for example, have a great fear of spirits and ghosts of people who died. They really look at ghosts like when somebody's died, you just don't talk about them anymore. You don't talk about them, mention their name anymore. You don't bring it up because you're always afraid of attracting that person coming back to you and causing mischief. And
but see, again, they're afraid that they're going to come back. So all of these rituals and rules were put into place so they don't come back and haunt you. Okay, go ahead. I'll shut up.
Well, it makes me wonder, why would they think that? Especially, let's say you have, a parent or a sibling, somebody who is the most loving, wonderful person in the world. Now you're suddenly worried that person's going to come back and start doing mischief, make you sick, make you evil, or being evil. What brought that concept on? I still struggle with that.
I don't think that it applies to all spirits. I mean, I think, there are a lot of cultures that have, that do ancestor worship, and they make little altars and they leave food for them. You find that a lot in, Native American cultures, Day of the Dead, where ancestors and dead people are venerated and worshipped. In Vietnam, they make little shrines and, hang the pictures of the parents up, because they think that these spirits, so they had the good send-off, but that they could come back and guide you and give you information and give you insights and wisdom and help make your life be more lucky and successful. But in some of them, there was a little caveat. But if you didn't worship them in the way that they wanted or in the way that they required, then they were going to come back and torment you, which I found really kind of interesting.
Oh, boy. So, I guess it's also the fact that when someone is in your life and they've died, you just don't want to let go of that person. You don't want to think that maybe that they don't exist anymore. And so you hold on to that hope that maybe they're still around somewhere. I mean, that's partly where maybe some of this idea of an afterlife would come from, because people didn't want to let go of their loved ones, or even great rulers. You had a great ruler and he kicks and, he's no longer there. So you want to remember him. And that's where a lot of them, I think, get put up to godlike status.
But we don't find any myths that say that anywhere. We don't find that category because we don't find ancestors being put on pedestals, and moved into like higher categories. There were either the gods and ancestral spirits, and they had a distinction between the two. You know, and then kind of tied to that, if you kept taking ancestral spirits and then adding them to the God Pantheon, then the God Pantheon would just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger as more and more ancestral spirits moved up the chain, kind of thing.
Well, I mean, I'll disagree.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I understand the logic, but it's not what we find.
Well, but there are two exceptions to that. Is one would be the Egyptian pharaohs, who were considered living embodiments of living gods. So even if they're died, they would still be god-like and joining that god pantheon. But for me, I look at like the old, from most of the old religions and old myths. Let's look at, just for sake of argument, let's say Norse mythology. You have Odin and Thor and Loki and all of the great gods. It goes the same with the Greek gods, the Roman gods, and yet when you read the stories of these gods, they sound like your average, everyday human person, except they have some special abilities. And there are times when I think, again, if we start looking, especially if you want to look at the ancient alien theory in this, is that we're dealing with possibly very, very mortal types of beings, entities, people, whatever you want to call them. And then the stories just got mythified later down the line where they become gods.
I'd like to agree, but I don't. I'm going to use your own example here. So you were talking about the Egyptians. You know, so there was Ramses the Great, you know, tied to the Noah or the Moses story. Whether that's true or not, I'm not going to speculate. But, you know, and he lived to be like 80-something years old, I think 83 years old. And so there were people who were born, lived, and died. I think 3 generations, you know, lived under the rule of Ramses. And so when he died, they truly thought a god had died because his life did seem eternal to them. However, Ramses doesn't ever enter into the godly pantheon. And so, you know, you make a great point, but we don't see that being evidenced. You know, we don't hear myths about Ramses. He's not floating around in the sky on some chariot. We don't, you know, he's identified because he's a god king and the representation of God on earth and the embodiment of God on earth. And the world revolved around the god king, but you don't find them, you know, in Egyptian culture put into that god category. You know, and to your Norse thing, you know, we were created in their image. And I just put a period there because it always makes me laugh. You know, I think that I believe that that we were trained by the extraterrestrials, you know, and that they were very much like us. The ones that we were created in their image were very much like us, you know, in looks. I mean, all we have to do is think of Zeus, you know, or think of our contemporary image of God, you know, Michelangelo's, you know, creation of man. I mean, it's excuse my political incorrectness, a white guy with a long flowing beard and long white robes. And where that starts getting interesting is that when you come into the Americas and you ask them, you know, what does God look like? It's a white guy with a beard and long white flowing robes. And so we even find descriptions of these same characters around the world that are part of this pantheon of God. And in my E.T. Chronicles book, which really deals with the era of the gods, where humanity is literally at the end of the book, you know, it tells these stories and kind of breaks them down into these different groups that my feeling is, although I couldn't find, there's not any mythic proof, that it was actually several different species of extraterrestrials that were on the Earth at earlier points in time and were responsible for the development of humanity and these mythic stories that we have. Yeah.
Well, can we go one further? What is your thought on the idea that these possible extraterrestrial entities not only were responsible for training and showing mankind different things, but possibly even creating us through genetic manipulation?
Oh, 100% believe it. 100%. You know, in the new book, Stepping Out of Eden, I talk about this whole notion of evolution and, you know, moving forward. And then there are creationists that say that God created everything on the planet, you know, including humanity. You know, and there are very different versions of creationists. You know, but one thing that every culture on the planet agrees with creationism about is that God created humanity, period. There aren't any stories of slow, gradual steps. You know, there was always some kind of creation event that happened. There are basically two narratives that you find around the world. One is that humanity was created from some kind of genetic material that came from the gods. And the other one is that humanity was created from mud or the salts of the earth. In some, there's genetic material that's put into a crucible that is made out of mud, you know, so you have this genetic material and this mud. We have multiple cultures that talk about several iterations that were made before the perfect man was created, you know, so there was this experimentation that happened. And so one of the things that I contend or, you know, kind of question back are some of the earlier specimens that we find in the archaeological record. I mean, because basically we go from not being upright, so still walking, you know, kind of on all fours about 5 million years ago. And within that 5 million year period of time, we're modern men. And scientists can't understand how we went through so many changes so fast. You know, and I mean, there's just too much that they can't explain. And when you start looking at the evidence, it's like, oh, well, they don't know how this happened, but around this time, you know, this happened. You know, I mean, there are genes that, there's this one gene, I think it's the FOXP2 gene, that hadn't changed in 7 million years or 70 million years. I mean, it just was stagnant. 70 million years is tied to language and communication. Except in the human lineage, it's changed twice. But they don't know why. Well, unless there was some reason that it needed to change, but it, you know, but they can't explain why, you know, or how. You know, and I mean, that's the thing, you know, you start asking very pointed questions and they can't explain it. It's like, well, we don't know. Well, we don't know. Well, we don't know. You know, but Occam's razor, take the simplest answer. You know, if you have genetic engineering happening, then the question goes away. I mean, it just simply goes away.
Well, when you look at genetic engineering, the idea of it's you could even point at a lot of the creation stories, and for one, I'll look at the creation story in the Judeo-Christian Bible in Genesis. God made Adam first. Okay, so he made him out of mud and clay. But then when it came time to do Eve, why couldn't he make Eve the same way? Instead, he had to put Adam to sleep. That's telling right there. Puts Adam to sleep, conducts surgery, and removes a part of his rib to use that to create Eve, which to me sounds like it's removing genetic material. in order to clone, manipulate, do whatever to create another living entity. So I've always found that part fascinating. Now, of course, if you start looking at all the heretical or the older books that were never included, you learn that, Adam did have a first wife before Eve. With
Lilith.
With Lilith, and they were created at the same time, and she was too independent and said, "I'm not going to be subservient to him, to hell with this," and she went off on her own. So then they decide, well, that didn't work out so well, so let's make another one for him, but this time we'll take a piece of Adam's rib to do it. So you could look at that story as possibly being a metaphor or even an allegory to maybe fits and starts in producing certain types of genetic results.
I agree.
Yeah, one result didn't give the required or the desired effects, so they had to do something like slightly different to create a new batch.
I agree. I don't find any corroboration for the Lilith story, but I'm going to put another little twist on it. I was talking about that there are a number of cultures that talk about multiple creations. And you could even say that the story of the creation of man that you find in the Bible is actually telling of two different creation events. Because in creation 1, God creates male and female, he created them. So that's Genesis 1. And then in Genesis 2, that's where he creates Adam from mud and blows the breath of life in him and then does the thing with Eve. And so you could even take a step back and go, well, they made that first male and female pair, but it didn't really work out. And so they made a new version, which turned out to be Adam.
Yeah, and
it's another interpretation. I mean,
Well, there's that interpretation. There's also another way to take it too. If he made man and woman and he made humanity in the first creation story, then in the next paragraph he talks about making Adam and then Eve. So two specific people. So is it retelling the same story twice, or is it telling two different concurrent stories? One, he created humanity. But then they start off on this little side experiment with Adam and then Eve and the Garden of Eden and all that, which starts to make more sense if you take into account that their first two kids, two sons, Adam and Eve, okay? Not Adam and Eve. Cain and Abel, and of course Cain kills Abel. And then he's banished. God puts a mark on him and sends him off to another land where he finds a wife and marries and continues on the lineage. Where did those other people come from? Were they part of the original creation talked about in the first chapter? And again, they were just a side experiment where maybe there's missing information there. People just automatically assume, well, Adam and Eve were the first people. Maybe they weren't. Maybe they were just part of this one experiment.
Well, and one of the things that I suggest in Stepping Out of Eden was that Adam and Eve mark a certain level of development in the human lineage. And so perhaps Cain actually went and lived with a lower level of humanoid development, so that there were other populations, that it wasn't just a stark blank earth and there weren't any, at least hominids, because we've had hominids. They weren't, homos, they were Australopithecines. So it's possible that he just went and lived. Because he's identified as, creating these cities and doing all of these things. But if he was a more advanced form of humanity, primitive, but more advanced form of humanity, then if he went and lived with a lesser group, then he would be really smart.
You could also apply that to what we know about the human development and different species of humans. And now that we're understanding that several of these species coexisted between Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon man and Homo sapiens sapiens, there is an overlap there, especially with Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon man. So maybe what if the Adam and Eve were part of the Homo sapiens sapien project, and then Cain went to go live off with the Cro-Magnon or Neanderthals people, as that different type of human. And of course, if he gets a wife and interbreeds with them, it creates a hybrid species.
We're all hybrid species, dude. And actually, where I put Adam, the first man, date-wise, I put him about 2.5 million years ago. 2.5 million years ago. I identify him as being a very late stage Australopithecine. So walking upright, having some early tool use, maybe Homo hablatus. So maybe the very first, it is so vague. You were talking about they find one little teeny piece of pottery and they, invent an entire city. It amazes me, Mark, that you could probably take all of the really ancient skeletal remains that have been found and put them in like one paper box, because it just doesn't sound like there's that much. They have like this piece of a jawbone and a tooth and a thigh bone, and they like create an entire species with full skeletons, and they have a fingernail. My
favorite of that is Gigantopithecus. Which is supposedly a giant hominid, likened to a great ape, and yet they've only ever found a jaw. And yet they go, okay, we found this jaw, so here's this big picture of what it looked like in this big ape. And it's like, it stood this tall. It's like, how do you know that? You've got a jawbone. It's not going to tell you what the backbone structure is like, leg structure, hands and feet, or any of that. You have a jawbone. And then they really jump to conclusions from there.
But it's like that for just about every species other than Australopithecus. And they have a new one that they found. But Australopithecus, which is the Lucy, and that is the most complete skeleton ever found. And trust me, it is the most complete because all they have is a jawbone or a thigh bone. And I sit there and I wonder, it's like we have this vast array of mythology and stories that come from cultures around the world that, in my opinion, are extremely congruent with each other, which says to me there has to be some truth. There has to be some underlying deep truths to what they're saying. And we won't look at that, and we won't look at this body of evidence that's there. But we're going to base everything and make a whole skeleton out of a little piece of jawbone.
Right.
I mean, I think it's kind of hypocritical.
Yes, I totally agree. If you start to also look at and I have a fascination with, quote, biblical history, unquote. And it's not even quite history. It's taking those stories, looking at them with a different point of view, especially the earlier in Genesis and the creation myths, because I think those are more allegories to our development and things that may have happened to us. But, there's some interesting things. I'm one of these people who look at the way that the language is written, especially in Genesis, where God is always talking to himself in the plural. We, us, and people think, well, it's God, because that's what we're told. Yes, it's just God. Well, are you sure it's just God, or is it a group? Is it a group of people who are talking amongst themselves? Is it a team? Let's say a lab team, who's putting together, working on this experiment. Then you have, and again, this is where modern religion, modern Christianity, they warp our perception of some of these old stories, because they tell you, well, then Satan tempted Eve. Well, it never said Satan. It said the serpent. Who was the serpent? And the serpent had arms and legs at that point. And that serpent, if you really read what it's saying, the God, the Elohim, tells Adam and Eve, okay, you can eat of every tree in the garden, but yeah, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you can't touch that one. Or life and death. You're not allowed to touch those two trees. We'll put them here to tempt you, but yeah, you're not allowed to touch them. And then the serpent talks to Eve and say, well, yeah, he doesn't. The Elohim don't want you to eat of this fruit because then you'll be just like them. You'll have intelligence. You'll be smart. You'll understand things, and tempts Eve to eat of the fruit, of course, which damns all humanity because the Elohim and God find out about it and they don't like that one bit. So, if you look at the story as okay, why were they trying to keep humanity dumbed down? And if we become godlike by having that understanding of having that knowledge presented to us, and the story of the serpent in the garden, which they think is Satan, and I think Satan gets a bad rap on that one, is very similar to other mythologies going on later, like say, oh, good Lord, I'm having a brain freeze. I just had the name on the top of my tongue. The god who provided mankind with fire and then was punished by the other gods. Prometheus, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and so the Prometheus legend is very similar to what the serpent did in the garden and was punished for it, for giving mankind this information, these extra abilities that the gods didn't want us to have. It seems like different versions going back to the same story.
Well, man, you've opened a huge door, and I'm taking notes. It's man, how much time do I got? But I'm going to come to that. But, we were talking about Adam and Eve, and I just want to make this one point before I move on.
Sure.
And you were saying, well, then God put Adam to sleep and took his rib and, made Eve. But, what people don't realize is that our belief in God is that God is omnipotent. And so when I think of the word omnipotent, and I'm a little bit of a Trekkie, and I think of Q from Star Trek, The Next Generation, and he snaps his fingers and a mariachi band appears and, he does this and, the ship is transported 12 galaxies away. He would do stuff because he was omnipotent. But when you read the stories out of the Bible or out of most myths, God is anything but omnipotent. He needs vehicles, he needs weapons, he needs these things in order to interact with the physical world. Well, how can you be omnipotent and need this stuff? Q certainly doesn't.
Well, and not only that needing these other vehicles or needing other things, but also makes mistakes. Mm-hmm. Makes mistakes at creating imperfect beings and then getting upset with them and then causing floods or, raining down fire and brimstone because he doesn't like something. It's like, well...
He's a whiner.
Oh, my opinion is the Old Testament God especially, which I think there were several and they all got kind of merged into under one umbrella, was just a narcissistic, egotistical child. Like Trelane. Well, you like Star Trek. What was it? Tremaine in Star Trek.
Uh-huh.
being the petulant child throwing a tantrum when it doesn't get his way.
Well, and one of the things which I found beyond interesting. So when I wrote, because I started with the E.T. Chronicles book, when I went to work on that book, there were two things that I said I have to go and I need to put to the side and not use as reference points. One was the Bible, and the other one was basically anything Zecharia Sitchin wrote, because I didn't want to prove the Bible, and I didn't want to reiterate what he wrote. I wanted to find my own research and put that forward, and if it matched, it matched. If it didn't match, it didn't match, and I was okay with that. And what I found was actually kind of shocking to me. I found that the stories that you find in Genesis, going up to the flood, and then once you pass the flood narrative, a lot of stuff changes, which I can talk about, but a lot of stuff changes. So I'm just going to talk to the flood.
Okay.
If you look at any other culture on the planet, they all have multiple gods. Okay, so any culture that does not have an Abrahamic root, because Abraham was the progenitor of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Okay, so anything that does not come from that root all have multiple gods. And so all of these stories tell about the scandals and conspiracies and wars and all of this stuff that is happening between these gods. Well, if you only have one God, I mean, other than being schizophrenic, which the God of the Bible does seem a bit schizophrenic, you can't fight with yourself. And so my feeling is that the people that put the Bible together had to take like a giant thing of white out and just eliminate the bulk of our history, the bulk of our mythic narrative. But there are a couple of very weird clues that we find, and this is the one that led me to more believe that it was paralleling. And so I have to sit here and think. So in Genesis, it talks about on the fourth day, God creates the plants and the plants and trees that are on the ground. Okay, which kind of doesn't make any sense because on the next day, or maybe that's the third day, but then the next day he puts the sun, the moon, and the stars in the sky. And so if you have any kind of, high school science, that photosynthesis doesn't happen unless there's sunlight. And so how could you have plants being on the land if there's no sun? So when I was first looking at that, I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And maybe there was a mistake in the Bible and it needs to be reversed and blah, 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 blah. I don't know. There's a number of reasons. But regardless, I don't want to say regardless, but in a large number of myths that you find from around the world. Okay, so there's this whole pre-story that happens, and I'm going to use Greek cosmology because people can track that the easiest. You have Uranus, the progenitor god, who came from some place in the cosmic egg to this world. And he has a family and he has the Titans, and he doesn't like the Titans, and so he sends them off to Tartarus, except one of his sons, Kronos, isn't sent there, and Kronos kills Uranus or castrates Uranus and takes control. And so Kronos is no longer on the world that they started on and comes to a watery world. And Kronos is tied to the fertility gods. He's considered a fertility god. The fertility gods are identified as being half man, half snake, half man, half fish, reptile, snake, but half human, half whatever. So then he has children, and my thought is that they're not really children. They're more a subjugated race of other extraterrestrials, but he has children. One of his children is Zeus. Zeus beats out Kronos. Kronos is sent to the depths of Tartarus, and Zeus takes control of the world. Now, Zeus is always described as being, white-skinned, white hair, long flowing robes, who we were created in his image. So now we have this half man, half snake down, and I'm pointing, if there was video, you could see I'm pointing down there with this white supreme god up there, okay? So you can kind of go back to your Adam and Eve story with that little piece, but I'm not going to Adam and Eve just yet, or I'm not even going to go there. But after this war, and so Kronos lived on a watery world. And so other stories, other mythic narratives talk about someone going and reaching down to the depths of the water and pulling up a little mud and then land formed. There are stories that after the death of one of the elder gods, like in Sumerian culture, it is the death of Tiamat, the mother serpent, and her body is used to form the earth. And so her blood becomes the rivers, and her hair becomes the trees, and her teeth become the mountains. And so there's this element of her biology being used to form this stuff. Now, at this point in time, now we have plants being formed on the land, no animals yet, and then the sun, moon, and stars are placed in the sky. So we have this terraforming event that occurs at the intersection of this other group taking over, and then the sun, moon, and stars are put in the sky. It's really interesting because it is in culture after culture after culture, which to me validates the Bible.
Interesting. Now, I mean, you can also look at some of the passages in the Bible and I'll go to Genesis for a moment, looking at what are the first words. In the beginning, the earth was without form and void. So they're talking about the earth, but yet there was no earth. There was no form. There was a void. It was nothing. Yet they called it the earth, which I think maybe when they were translating it, I just feel like they got some concepts misunderstood. And then it says, then God said, let there be light. And there was light. Well, what was the light? Could it have been the Big Bang? It's possible.
That's my thought.
Yeah. And then he creates the heaven and earth he creates the land and the water, and then the sky above, and then the stars, and all of that. Our religion, and when I went to Bible school, they teach us that's how God is forming the earth, which is the planet we're living on. Well, now we understand that the earth is just a molecular spot in the fabric of creation. So could the term the earth in the Bible be referring to a much broader birth of the universe?
That's a great question.
Until it finally comes down to creating the land and sea and the animals and all of that. And even then you could look at that in a broader sense. And even when he created man and woman, well, did he create him here on earth? Was it here? If you take out the idea of that everything is earth-centric, could the man and woman together be a representation of other intelligences and species out there in the universe? Until he gets to the Adam and Eve point, which might be the planet Earth experiment. It's a thought.
Great observation.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make a little minor correction.
Okay.
In your biblical recall. So the first line, it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And then the next line is, and the earth was waste and void, and the darkness covered the abyss. Okay, so that's line 1, line 2. Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting, okay, so if you look at the interpretation, okay, so this is my thing, and of course, no one ever listens to what I say, but people should listen to what I say, darn it. So if you take that first line, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and say, this is just an introduction to this entire chapter, like a little,
it's like a forward
email headline.
Yeah, it's a forward to the book.
Right. And just take that as totally separate from what follows, because then the next line that says the earth was waste and void and darkness covered the abyss. Well, what's interesting is you start looking at other cultures and they talk about this watery world or not watery, but things were black and there was darkness everywhere. And so there is this notion of nothingness that you find everywhere in every other culture. And so they're trying to compare, what should be line 2 or, what is line 2 in our text to line 1 with theirs. But it's, yeah, I think it creates a lot of confusion. But if you take that first line out, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and just use that as a chapter heading, then the rest of it makes much more sense. And I totally agree with you where it says, and there was light. So they say that within so many picoseconds after the Big Bang that the universe was filled with photon energy and the universe was light. And so my feeling is that up until you get into I think day 3 or day 4, I don't know, I don't have it in front of me. We're really talking about galactic creation, and where he separates the light from the darkness. You mentioned this before, and I just kind of speculated, well, is that where he's separating out firm matter from dark matter? I mean, we don't know because it's an interpretation, but if you look at that narrative from a cosmological narrative in epochs and then bring it down into the development of the planet within the last, couple of days, it's totally congruent with what science knows. I mean, that's the thing. It's congruent with what science knows.
Again, there's so much with our history that is hidden from us. I feel I think we've got it so wrong for the most part. Especially what we're taught in our schools is wrong. Everything from how we first formed, how we were created, and I do believe created, not evolved. I mean, I think there's always open for some evolution. Your bodies do adapt. We do respond to different things over time. There could also be ongoing manipulation. We still deal with, to this very day, people who tell stories of encounters and abductions, genetic material being taken, and dealing with hybrid children. Now, people could say, oh, that's bunk, it's BS, and think of it, it's just as much of a fantasy or a myth as, some of these ancient writings, but yet it still seems to be happening today. What if this is something that has been occurring throughout our entire history?
And I think it's very possible. I get asked that question a lot, and there is much in the mythic record that supports what people talk about in contemporary UFO society. The nature of the encounters that they have. I mean, there are stories of, people going into these underground realms where there are cities, and people being abducted in the mythological record. And I'm going to back up here a little bit because I think I need to be a little clear. Because I was talking about things changed after the flood. And so the stories we have that are from in the beginning to the flood narrative and through the flood narrative, there's a consistency that we find around the globe. I mean, you start looking at it and you find the same stories, a little bit different, little different characters. Some might have this part of it to be more important, that another group might have this part, but you find basic concept. The sun, moon, and stars being placed in the sky, the idea of a golden age, the idea of a cosmic egg, so you find these nuggets that of consistency, and you look at the narrative before and you look at the narrative after, and even though it might not be identical, it's pretty similar that you can go, yeah, they're talking about the same event, and the big, golden ring is, the sun, moon, and stars being placed in the sky, the golden age. But after the flood, I call it the rise of mankind, the age of man, because the mythic narrative changes dramatically. And it's no longer the stories of the gods about the gods, with humanity as being just a footnote that aren't even really part of the stories. We become front and center, and is the stories of humans about humans. and they might interact with the gods, and so we find, using a character that we'll all know is like Moses. Moses is a central character and he interacts with God, so there are very specifically defined people that interact with God. It's not he's hanging out with everybody. And the position where earlier, the stories are like, hey, we're all hanging out and drinking some beers and, like so-and-so is going to go have a war with these people over here. Hey, it's cool. We're watching on TV. That's kind of the attitude in those earlier myths. Where in the later myths, it's like, oh, God, please come and help me. There is this air of reverence and our desire to have this God or gods come help us and intervene on our behalf. It is just such a different perspective of the author, but we also lose completely the consistency of mythology. So as we start getting into the story of Troy or Moses or any of these later myth stories, they are the stories of man and not the stories of God. And you can't look for consistency unless it's, if you're talking about New Zealand and Hawaii, they're connected, culturally. But if you have an expectation of finding the same story in, South America, maybe not so much. So, I was going somewhere.
Did you get there?
No, but I think that's a big nugget.
You left some baggage along the way. Okay. Well, it's interesting for me because I agree with you that it seems like after the quote-unquote flood, things changed. And I think that that's something to consider. There's a lot of evidence out there that there was a worldwide disaster. And, I follow people like, I'm sure you're familiar with Brian Forster. Mm-hmm. And his work in going to these ancient megalithic sites, which are far more advanced than anything we have today. And the one consistent thing that seems to come up is that there was this big change. It seems like a cataclysm 12,600 years ago. And it coincides with Göbekli Tepe, with Pumapunka, and then the later rise of what modern science thinks of as the modern, the first civilizations, the first Sumerians, then the Egyptians and whatnot. But they also had this advanced technology that just seemed to disappear over time. Nobody knew what happened. I've always been of the opinion that we have had all of these old stories and myths of the gods were of very real people, entities, technologies, societies that were lasting on this earth for possibly hundreds of thousands of years before a great calamity happened. And with that calamity, we had the reset button hit. Let's say right now, for sake of argument, let's say we get hit by an asteroid. Okay, it's an extinction level event. The Earth resets, and let's say maybe there are some survivors, but civilization is gone. All of our electronic records are gone, certainly. Whatever books or whatever are around for a while till they decay and gone, because everything that we have now decays so quickly. That's why we find the old things made of stone and pottery that have lasted for thousands of years. But so what happens with each new generation? They get amnesia. They start forgetting more and more and more. And then now everything becomes myths and legends. And not saying that we did not have interactions with extraterrestrials. I do believe there is part of that. But I also think that there were more advanced human civilizations that were on this earth before this catastrophic event pretty much decimated everybody and everything, and pretty much we had to start all over again from scratch. And with the more time went on, we de-evolved. We forgot information, or information was hoarded by a few who died off and wasn't shared with the rest of the people. And so we became more and more primitive till we started off that, hey, we're hunter-gatherers, and maybe we have some agriculture, and then cities start to be rebuilt. We relearn some of the information we used to have, and the rest of it just sounds like fantastic stories from the past, but that's actually telling oral history of maybe what we had before. Did I stump you on that one?
No, I just, I just like, well, I don't want to disagree again.
You're allowed to disagree. That's what I love about, this isn't the American political system. We are allowed to disagree. We can debate. We can talk. And God knows I'm certainly learning as I go. So I'm not an authority.
Doing interviews on my work becomes a little challenging at times, because when I write, I look for data. And I report the data, in a palatable way so that somebody can understand what I'm talking about.
Right.
And one of the biggest complaints, this book is too new, so who knows what people will say. One of the biggest complaints about the E.T. Chronicles book was that I didn't provide any conclusions, and I intentionally didn't provide any conclusions because I feel like my job is to go through all those dry, dusty books and read them and present the information and present the evidence, and then you can take the evidence and come to your conclusions. It's not my job to make a conclusion for you, and so, but when you do a radio interview, it's kind of like you have to take all of this massive data, and come up with a conclusion so you can keep it within 2 hours. And so when you review the mythic record, it doesn't appear that way. That's the best I can say. It doesn't appear that way. And I kind of have an issue with the 12,000 year date of the flood. Any written evidence that we have that date the flood put it at about 25 to 30,000 BC. So the Sumerian Kings list, there's a date that comes out of China, as well as one that comes out of Egypt. So 25 to 35,000 BC. So that we have as written evidence. And so as you start looking, you just see these blips, but you don't find an extinction event. And so all right. So in the E.T. Chronicles book, it's like, okay, well, here's the flood, and based on myth, that was really where humanity took off. There were a lot of gods that lived on the planet, and they got rid of the gods with the flood, and humanity survived, and this is their rise. And you find blips that happen, but you don't find that extinction level event. And the other part is that we have parallel myths in South America and Australia, and global. The Noah myth is the most consistent global narrative we have, with the getting fire as being the second most consistent myth we find around the world. But Australia was populated somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years BC, and the Americas 13,000 BC. And so how could they have the narratives that they have? And it was even the Spanish conquistadors, when they first came to the Americas, were confounded how they could know about the Noah's flood, because they were, a bunch of heathens, and how could they know anything about the one true, God and the flood? And so that's coming from the 1500s, which, they weren't converted yet, because these were really early missionaries. But I did look at it in Stepping Out of Eden, going back, because one of the things that we do know from Sumerian texts is that it talks about that this group, or this god, the Onas, came and lived with humans 6 times, 3 times before the flood and 3 times after the flood. And it's interesting because we find 3 blips after the flood. And I was like, okay, so if we had 3 blips after the flood, if we start looking at the development of humanity, are we going to find 3 blips as well? And what I ended up finding, which kind of really makes sense to me a lot, both time-wise, line-wise, and in a bunch of other areas, is the Mount Toba eruption that happened 74,000 years ago. It was like way bigger than Krakatoa. And what they've identified was that with the eruption of Mount Toba, it was an extinction level event. And that human populations went down to, they think, maybe 10,000 breeding pairs or 10,000 individuals. It was a very small number. And so there is a documented extinction event. When we look at these other dates, there's no record of any kind of extinction event hitting human populations that, so we don't have the narrative being supported, and so there were a lot of people that were talking about, well, the ash fallout from Mount Toba. But if you have that kind of a volcanic eruption, can you imagine the tsunamis and the giant waves that would have engulfed different areas on the planet? And then, so we have that part. With it being 74,000 years ago, it would have predated populations moving into Australia as well as moving into the Americas. And so we have a number of different factors that actually support that date, or that event. So, and
that's interesting because I wasn't aware of those other that documentation pointing to 74,000 years ago. So, which brings up another interesting point. If, let's say, it was this volcano that caused, the massive explosion, you're right, tsunamis flooding in, great flood, makes perfect sense. I always thought it was possibly we could have been dealing with an asteroid event, but that works just as well. And yet, still, in all of the research they've done based on the writings that have been found and human civilization and everything seems to only be happening within about the last 5,000 years or so. And that's as far back as they can find anything with humans. So what was going on?
That's our third blip.
Yeah. Yeah. Where was what was happening in that 70,000 years in between? If humans were around and they did survive, and then where did they go from there?
I mean, but in the development of humanity, we were still Homo erectus, so we weren't even Cro-Magnon man yet.
So that's a possibility of during that time, that's when the start of this genetic manipulation started, possibly from these outside influences.
Well, I mean, I think that, there have been several rounds of genetic manipulation. As and I'm sure you've talked about this story, but there's my take on it. In the Old Testament, there is a story about the Nephilim. In these days, the Nephilim walked the earth, and then the sons of God saw the daughters of man, and they had relations, and their children were the Geborim. And, so if you read mythic narratives, there were a race of giants that lived on the earth prior to the creation of humanity. And the reality is that there was a war that happened between the gods and the giants, and the outcome of that war was that the gods decided to create humanity. So that was the reason why humanity was created in the first place. And so it would only seem natural, if there were already giants on the planet, that when the sons of God and daughters of men story happened, that there might still be giants on the planet in those days. And so I believe that narrative talks about a genetic infusion of these God characters into human populations. But I'm all about, I have to find it somewhere else. I have to find another narrative somewhere else. And we find a parallel narrative that, and let me just add the last part. So we have the gods interbreeding with humanity. So now they're producing a hybrid race of part god, part human, and their offspring in the biblical terms were men of renowned. People say they were giants. You only find that in the Septuagint. I don't agree with that translation. I think that we are talking about the demigods. I mean, what's a demigod? It's part god, part human. So like Hercules and Perseus and that whole group, who lived all before history. They were all pre-writing characters. But we find a parallel narrative that comes out of the Ramayana. And without going into the story of the Ramayana too much, at one point in time, Rama the main point of the story is the demon god of Lanka kidnaps Rama's wife, Sita, and he wants to get her back. And so he enlists this group that are called the Vanara. Okay, so, and I'm going to come back to who and what the Vanara were. But he enlists the Vanara, and they help him to build a bridge, a causeway from mainland India to the island of Lanka. And then they battle with Ravana and his troops and win and get Sita back for Rama. Okay, so that's the narrative, sort of. Very condensed. Well, it turns out that Vishnu, their supreme god, knew that Rama was going to be battling against the demon god of Lanka because they really didn't like Ravana and they wanted to get rid of him, but they couldn't kill them themselves. They had to get somebody else to do the dirty deed. And so Vishnu had all of the other gods of the heavens come down to the earth and have relations with the apes and bears on the planet. And so there are some that suggest that the apes were ape-like, not monkeys, but ape-like. And so their offspring were these individuals who had advanced characters. And so like our mythic narrative, in the West, humans aren't really talked about. In the Ramayana, we only learn the name of 3, maybe 4 of these Vanara. One of them, his name was Hanuman, and his father was the god in charge of god of air. And so his son had the ability to leap long distances because he could become lighter than air. Then there were 2 other characters that are briefly named in the book. Their father was the god of architecture and building, and they had the engineering knowledge and prowess to help Rama construct this bridge. And so all of these hybrids had advanced skills, advanced knowledge, and except in the biblical story, it's a torrid event. In the Ramayana, it's a blessed and praised event, and where we're left with, we get these parallel stories, but there are different positions, like, is it good? Is it bad? Was it a good, and so it gets kind of interesting, but I believe that they are telling parallel stories for very different reasons that document this interbreeding of the gods with humanity.
Which falls in line with a lot of the other mythology, with how gods created man, and looking at the what we do know so far, what we know of the fossil record and the different species of humans and hominids that had advanced over the years. And we have to also admit too that there's probably big chunks and gaps that are missing. How can you suddenly go from one type of human, like let's say go from Australopithecus to a Neanderthal, who there's great differences there, because Australopithecus was still very ape-like, where Neanderthals, although they had the brow ridges and they were shorter and they had some qualities, like it was a big change. What would cause in the history of evolution for that drastic of a change to happen? And the one thing that I always crack up when I think about humans in general, if you take a look at modern humans, we really are a funny looking lot compared to the rest of the natural world around us. Look at all the different animals and whatnot. We're like one of the only ones without hair, and we only have it in patches, like on our head and under our arms and whatnot. Any significant hair anyway, although I know some guys that put some apes to shame.
They're part Neanderthal.
Yeah, I believe it. Our hands and feet and the development of how those developed compared to, even if when you look at the apes, all of the apes, even the great apes, chimpanzees and gorillas, while they may have an ability to walk on hind legs for a short period of time, they still have to walk hunched over. They walk on knuckles and hands, and the feet have the opposable toes. Everything's just different. Yeah, I look at my feet and I'm going, feet are weird. They just don't look right. And when you look at how the extremities are in a lot of different animals that seem to fit with that animal so much more than what ours do, and yet they work perfectly natural in terms of walking upright, running, and yet there's just something about them that seem very unnatural to me.
And our feet are always too big for our body. Have you noticed that? But what's interesting is that the transition from like Homo habilis, or Australopithecines, which are just before that, and Homo erectus was only like 1 million years, and so they can't figure out. So I think between Australopithecines and Homo erectus, it was 3 million years, and it was about 1 million years between Homo erectus and Homo habilis. And what they can't figure out is how Homo erectus, in that little bit of time, lost its body hair, had started having social interactions. Their ability to manufacture much, much more complex tools developed. They had sophisticated social structures, and they had the rudiments of a culture as we know it, because they found that they lived in small societies and actually built temporary shelters to live in, and so they don't know how to do it, so I said I placed the first man, about 2.5 million years ago, and I feel like that genetic engineering, that interbreeding with the Nephilim, with the sons of God and the daughters of men,
the Watchers,
is what actually gave rise to Homo erectus, because we went from being much more primitive and much more animal-like to crossing that line to beginning to have culture. There is a seashell that they found that has an engraving on it. I mean, now granted, it's just little lines. And there are some people that believe that that seashell is actually the earliest piece of art ever produced. And that was done by Homo erectus. So there was a huge cognitive shift that happened, not just physiological, but a cognitive shift that happened with Homo erectus, and so if we ate of the tree of knowledge, then maybe the production of that knowledge is what's coming through with Homo erectus and its descendants.
Well, then, trying to think again, if you go back to the mythology and the creation stories, and we talked earlier of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, could those stories be talking about a different time period, a different version of the human development? If we're dealing with genetic manipulation from Homo habilis to Australopithecus then into Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon man, if you wanted to look at the story of Adam and Eve and how they're created, how they already could speak, communicate, build cities, move forward from there, would have to come way later, much, much, much later.
Or the stories are a little bit bastardized.
Oh, and I feel that's the case. You can't take them literally. I think that in most of the cases, most of the older stories, it's like most mythologies, they get a little embellished over time. They get, or facts get lost, some get changed to make the story more interesting. And, I think at its core, it's trying to tell a story about what happened, and you're also using the language of the time of the author.
Exactly.
Not saying it's the language of the time of the people who lived it, because this could get into one of those situations where you're dealing with something much more knowledgeable and advanced earlier, and then the people who forgot or don't know, and then you try to explain it in your simple language. So you have gardens, eating of a fruit of a tree gives you knowledge, instead of maybe it was certain, genetic manipulations to try to produce a more intelligent type of human who could do certain reasoning, have certain cognitive abilities, or whatnot.
And actually, there is a consistency of narratives that talk about trees, but they're more tied to immortality versus knowledge. But there are stories that talk about, like there's one Sumerian story, and just trying to be very brief because I know we're almost out of time, where Enki's son gets to go to the heavens and visit with Anu, and Enki tells him, don't eat any of the food because you'll die. And, kind of sounds like the biblical narrative, don't it? And so he goes up, and Anu offers him food, and he turns it down. And as he's getting ready to leave, Anu says, well, I don't understand why you didn't eat any of the food, because if you had eaten this food, you would have been granted immortality, and you would have been a god like us. And he goes back down, and, he didn't get this gift. So there is this connection between eating and immortality or knowledge, but it would always make you more godlike, something they really didn't want us to have. Oh, and I want to throw in another little piece of evidence tying to the Ramayana story. Mm-hmm. So the Ramayana is set during the Treta Yuga. And so the Treta Yuga existed from 2,100,000 and something thousand years ago to about 780,000 years ago. And Rama lived during the latter part of the Treta Yuga. Okay, so if you think about it, I'm suggesting that the Sons of God, Daughter of Men story happened about 1.5 million years ago with the rise of Homo erectus. Okay, so that act, the Sons of God, Daughters of Men act, happened before the birth of Rama. Rama was born, at the latter part of the Treta Yuga. So let's say, 1,200,000 years ago. I mean, it puts him during that same period of time, because he was long gone by the end of the Treta Yuga, which was 780,000 years ago. So we have corroboration to push that date back further, in my opinion.
Very much. Very interesting. Very interesting. Now, we got about 7 or 8 minutes left. You mentioned a little bit about the Sumerians, and you said you didn't want to talk too much about or get into it at that point. What is it, in your opinion, that makes the Sumerians suddenly stand out as one of the first civilizations?
Well, and I did kind of touch on that a little bit, but I'll go into more detail. Anywhere you look, when it comes to how we learned about something, discovered something, the gods gave it to us. The gods gave us fire. The gods gave us metallurgy. The gods gave us agriculture. They gave us weaving. They gave us, you name it. If it's on a list of stuff that we can do, they gave us astrology. They gave us astronomy. They gave us medicine. They taught us what plants we could eat. They taught them how to dig with sticks and get roots up from under the ground. I mean, the list of things that they taught us is huge. It's huge. And I was talking a little earlier about that the gods came and spent time on Earth 6 times, 3 times before the flood, 3 times after the flood. And we see these kind of blips in rise of information, rise of knowledge, the rise of culture that happen at different periods of time in our development. And I think that when they came, which was around that 5,000 BC, that they did a major download to humanity and gave us the wheel, gave us, they had already given us agriculture. So, gave us metallurgy because that came in, they taught us about the movement of the stars in the sky, so there was a lot of things that we were trained in during that period of time. But that was the third blip after the flood.
So the flood being a very pinnacle point in the development of humanity and the big change that we experienced in our history, where the gods were presiding mostly in the before the flood stage to just being humanity after the stage. And yet there are those stories from many different civilizations that even after the flood myths, after dealing with from the Egyptians to the Sumerians to even people, the Aztec and Mayan cultures in South America, still dealing with the gods, still dealing with these advanced cultures who come down and provide knowledge about medicine and the stars. Look at South America, which really gets overlooked a lot in terms of human development and what these Indian cultures who, when the conquistadors came over here and the Spanish came over here, they still had the cities. They were living in the big cities, but they were still had aspects that were very primitive, and yet they still built these big structures going back a few hundred years ago to even a couple thousand years ago. Again, it's post-flood based on the time that we discussed. And yet they still had interactions with the gods, with Viracocha, with Quetzalcoatl, the red-headed, bearded man who came down and gave them all this knowledge and taught them and then left and went back to the sky. So there still seemed to be a lot of interaction in a lot of these cultures with possible extraterrestrial beings much later on.
Right. Oh, no, I agree. There was still contact, but it was limited contact, and again, we're telling the story about interacting with these gods. Mm-hmm. The gods aren't telling their story. So it's just a perspective narrative. So we don't know what they want. We don't know why they're giving us stuff. We don't, you know what I mean? We're kind of out of the loop of what's going on, other than they're coming and giving us this great technology, which some people suggest was the downfall of humanity in the first place. Right.
Fantastic. Well, we could keep talking about this for hours because I'm like you. This fascinates the living hell out of me. But we have run out of time, so we've been talking tonight with Dr. Rita Louise and her new book, Stepping Out of Eden. Now, Rita, where can people get the book, and how can they get in touch with you or learn more about you?
Sure. You can get the book obviously through any normal distribution outlet. I would really appreciate it if you went to my website, soulhealer.com, soulhealer.com, and purchase a book directly from me. It does come autographed, which is always very cool. And if you purchase a book and send me a nice email, I will also, as a free gift for listeners of the show, so say that, you've heard me talking to Mark, that I will send you a copy of E.T. Chronicles, also known as Man-Made, the Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, for free as an ebook.
Phenomenal. All right. Well, Rita, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll definitely have to have you back someday.
Would love to, Mark. Always love spending time with you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to another edition of Paranormal UK Radio. Tune in every Wednesday night at 10 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time in the UK, Eastern Time in the US, here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. If you miss a show, you can always catch our podcasts from Podbean, Stitcher, iTunes, you name it, you can find us. So thanks again for listening. We'll be back next Wednesday. Hopefully Irene is feeling much better and will be able to join us then. We'll catch you later. Everyone have a great week. We'll talk to you soon.